Whenever.
Perfect. Get started. Alrighty. Awesome. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Talk Out. And I'm actually very, very excited for this episode. Uh, on this episode, we'll be having a conversation with my mentor. And let me just give you a little background just so everybody understands how far we've actually come. Jay has been guiding me since I was 14 years old. A 14-year-old rambunctious kid jumping on the couches of Upward Bound, almost getting kicked out of the program. And now I'm 32 years old with a lot of professional development, and he's really helped me develop both emotionally, rationally, and how to present myself both in a professional manner and also in a balanced, respectful, compassionate manner as well. So that's just an introduction to Jay. Jay, I'll have you introduce yourself, and then from there we'll jump into our discussion about how to win at work.
Thanks, Kibbs. I guess partly I would say you would say I'm your mentor. And also my official name, if you look for it on LinkedIn or anywhere else, would be James Guilford, but most people call me Jay Guilford. In addition to being Kibbs' mentor, I'm founder and managing partner of Coworks Leadership Strategist. So kind of my life calling and what I do and my consulting firm is I guide leaders and individuals growing to leaders to adopt leadership skills that help them win at work. So I've worked with a lot of different organizations, a lot of Fortune 500s, a lot of Fortune 100s. I don't need to name drop. I've also worked with leaders on every level. A lot of VP and senior level executives called C-level executives like CHOs, CROs, CEOs, CFOs, C-level executives. And I've coached a lot of people and teams to help them work better together. So that's kind of what I do. And Kibbs and I go way back when we both were younger. And I'm excited you invited me on the podcast.
Yeah, I'm super happy for you to be here. Our overarching theme is the fact that we spend a lot of time at work. So we're just going to dissect that and talk about three things. But we'll first start about with how do you develop like a respectful clinical distance while at work, and how do you actually go through that, both in like managing and having a respectful clinical distance both while you're in the office and also outside of the office when you're at company parties, for example.
So where I think where I would start is that the reason why work is important. A lot of people have asked me like, why do you talk about people at work? Why do you talk about people at work? It's because we spend 96,000 hours on average in the United States at work, and that number is probably growing considering that people are working from home. A lot of people are working more hours. 96,000 hours is a lot of time in your life. If you even think about it, you spend 8 hours at work, a couple of hours with friends and family, and then some amount of hours alone, and then you're asleep. So backing up, I would say the reason why work is important is because it can become your life for between your mid 20s and up until you retire at 60. So I think clinical distance is important at work. Kibbs, why don't you start? You can tell me what you think clinical distance is, and I can talk more about it.
Um, yeah, that's great actually. That was one of the main things that you had taught me. So, Jay first started as my teacher at Upward Bound, and then from there we became colleagues. And when he was the director of interns, and that was a position that you held for quite a while. And then so I started as when I first started, my first professional job was working as a summer counselor, as an intern at Upward Bound, and that's when Jay taught me clinical distance. And what does clinical distance mean? It's like having like a healthy, and I would even say like a compassionate distance with the people that you actually work with. And for me, like I was working with high school students at the time. And just to give people background of this, I started work at Upward Bound when I was 19 years old. And the kids that I'm working with are all high school students, so they're 14, 15 years old, and we're all around the same age group. So because of that, we're all listening to the same music, and the kids can easily get you roped in to like, their way of life. What Jay taught me is like, and what I appreciate and what I see clinical distance as is like, it's okay to mingle. It's okay to have fun. It's okay to connect with the people that you're working with, both your superiors, and I don't want to use the word inferiors, your peers as well. But the most important thing is not losing track of the mission that's in mind. So let's rewind back to me being 19 years old and work at Upward Bound, right? So like the kids rope you into the rap music that they listen to and all the other things that they get involved in, the video games that they're playing with, and all of that. And it's very easy to forget that our goal at Upward Bound is to make sure that every single one of these students go to college and graduate with a 4-year, 2-year degree or a master's, a doctorate. It's very easy to get lost in the sauce, so to say. So this clinical distance is like, oh yeah, oh you're listening to this rap song, man, I love that rap song. Can you show it to me after you finish writing that 3-page paper? So always making sure that we keep the kids on track, and also like have a healthy and professional distance and not oversharing, because I am still their superior in many ways, like the students, and they don't need to know what's happening at home. I don't need to share my traumas with them. I don't need to overshare or tell them anything about anything that doesn't relate to where they're actually going. So that clinical distance was very important for me to learn.
Yeah, it's really having the, for me, I would say, it's having the emotional maturity to keep the work mission at the center. And that's for any work environment. So again, like at Overbound, it was the case because we were living and working with students. And whether you're a teacher or you're in a corporate environment or you're a first time at a job and it's at a nonprofit, no matter what the situation is, it's like what's important to win at work is that there's a mission, literally there's a goal for the organization. And if you have the emotional maturity to keep that goal centered at the center, even in spite of your personal preferences or what's going on with colleagues, it makes actually work more fun and you're much more successful. So that's what it is.
Yeah.
It's important because what can happen at work is that you can have these preferences and then you can demonize other people. You can start to gossip or talk about people, or I'm not talking to them, or I'm not talking to her because of this. And what's really at the center is that you're both on a team and you're trying to, let's say, build a presentation. Yes, maybe they said something snarky to you in an email, or maybe you thought it was snarky because you probably didn't ask them what they really meant. Maybe they said something snarky you thought it was. The larger goal is to succeed with the project or the presentation for the client or for the customer, or for the students. So if you can keep that in mind, emotional and maturity says, oh, and clinical distance, that's what it is. It says, I have the clinical distance, as I should say, I have the emotional maturity to rise above my own feelings and to work well with this colleague to get the project done. And it's something that, again, I've worked with leaders on all levels. It's kind of a master key to win with every single team member, whether they're a senior leader or they're a sideways colleague or they're a direct report who's reporting up to you. If you have that clinical distance and you can keep the mission at the center, then you don't get into that emotional entanglement that can cause you to be snarky at work. So that's kind of the master key. So now the kids, all your listeners know that they can move on and conquer the world.
Yeah, exactly. And another thing I wanted to add to everything that you had stated is that like clinical distance is also important once like you have like an authoritative position and you actually need to give out a consequence. That the consequence is never because like you're being punitive or because you're angry at somebody, but because like I need to release you from this position because you're not doing the work that's necessary to complete this mission. And that's a very difficult conversation to have. If you are able to build like a rapport of having clinical distance from the very, very beginning, it becomes much easier to make those decisions because that's a hard decision to make. So yeah.
And
Something
I
like
would
that.
say even on the opposite, let's say you're in a position, first of all, it's like if let's say it's just sideways colleagues, you want to have clinical distance because they might be reporting to you or you might be reporting to them. But it also means that let's say you're in a position where you can give out not just consequences but rewards, raises, and promotions. You want to be sure that you're looking at the value of each individual's work and not your friend, because that would be called favoritism or nepotism. So it's again just helpful because you want to, if you keep the work at the center, then you're always succeeding at work, and that's literally what you're getting paid for.
Yeah, very, very good point. The other point I actually wanted to tackle with you is the this how would I say, in my generation, we're constantly moving careers. And I would say that it is surprising when I hear that someone my age has been in a position for like more than 5 years, because it's pretty much like every 2 or 3 years we're bouncing from a different job. It might be along the same careers, but it's not always with the same company. Whereas before, I would say my parents' generation was expected that you'd be at a company for 30, 40 years or something like that. So because we've had this generational shift, how do you think that impacts both the way that the generations interact with one another, and also like how we perceive being at work, if we can always move on to the next, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I would first give an understanding or an explanation of why that shift occurred. It is less to do with the generations, but also the technology. So, 30 years ago, when you wanted a job, you had to walk around your neighborhood or look for, hiring signs or look in the newspaper. That was just how you did it. There was not really a way to connect in 30 seconds to someone in a different neighborhood, not even across the United States or across the world, because the technology wasn't there. So
Mm.
companies, everyone was trained to understand that when you found a job, you stayed at the job or you kept that employee, because the technology wasn't there on either end to make quick shifts in either employment or hiring. Now we're in a situation where from your phone, you can apply in your pocket. Phones, I remember when phones did not fit in your pocket. They're now in a situation that from your phone in your pocket, which is also a computer, you can apply for a job, accept a job offer, and arrange to move across the world. So it's that different. I wouldn't call it instability. The different type of stability or the different ways we work at work. Everyone's doing it this way now. Most people, it's not generational. It's just we all have the technology, so everyone's shifting jobs much more than they did in the past. And it's simply because we have the technological infrastructure to do it. So when people talk about the generational differences, I think it's less about the outlook of different generations. I think it's more about we all now have access to this top technology. Mostly, if you've been in a job for 25 years, you're probably going to stay there for the last 5 years before you retire. So it's not likely that you're going to take advantage of the technology and say, I only have 5 years to retire, so I'm gonna move somewhere else. So even when you think about how generations are approaching work, it's more about what they've been trained to do and where the benefits are. It's not beneficial for someone who's been to it for 20 years to suddenly try to shift gears. You can, and people do it. It's just less likely, probably.
Yeah. Oh, oh, very, very good point, actually. Um, do you think that that's going to cause any rift in the relationships, or how people actually form bonds at work? If they feel like they're only here for like 4 or 5 years, or do you think that people still seek to form like these deep relationships at work?
With work from home, what the data is showing is that I think Society of Human Resource Management, they're SHRM, they're like the human resource uh, gurus. They know, they collect all the data. And what they found is that the one thing that people say, many things they say are missing at work, but the number one thing is human connection because of hybrid and remote work. Now, I'm not advocating that people go to an office or go to a building or work from home or any of those things. It'll work out as the world unfolds. So I'm not getting into that political argument. What we do know though is that when you're staring into the black box of Zoom or a computer screen, you're not making a connection. Like even right now, if everyone's paying attention, it probably looks like I'm looking you in your eye, but I'm actually looking into the eye of the camera because I know biologically, if I look into the eye of the camera, you're going to be looking at me and it's going to look like I'm looking at you. But if I don't do that, then we're going to establish less of a connection. So most people don't think about that at work. I do a lot of online presentations. So I'm like, it looks like I'm looking at you. But if I were to look at Kibbs, this is how I would be looking. But it doesn't. So we're missing that human connection at work. And that's one of the primary things that we're missing. So the technology answers a bunch of questions. It solves a lot of problems because now you don't have to drive 28 minutes. each way, which is the average commuter in the United States. And now you don't have to figure, you have 30 more minutes with your kids, or to do yoga, or to go to an AA meeting, or to sleep in, or to walk your dog. People are using that time wisely. What we are missing, and this is simply a fact, is that you're connecting to your computer and you're seeing a human face. You're not in person connecting to the human and reading all of the body language that you're missing from usually the shoulders down. So
Yeah.
Kibbs, I would say, yeah, it has changed the nature of work. It has changed the nature of the way that we collaborate, communicate. It's, some people would say it's less in trust, it's less in creativity. Some statistics say that. I'm not weighing in on if we should work from home or not, or any of that stuff, but the nature of our relationships at work have changed.
Yeah. And what's so interesting is that actually this is gonna kind of bleed well into the next question about how not to be a bully, which is something that I felt like I was when I first took my first authoritative position. But just on the context of relationships at work and forming bonds at work, one of the most important ways of forming bonds is to actually work through conflict together. And this is not, I don't really want to delve into the political aspect of this as well. That's not what's interesting for me, but more so in the problem solving manner of it, of like, how do we then like resolve conflicts and problems via Zoom? Because it is a bit easier when I can just knock on your office, Jay, and be like, hey, like, Jay, something, you left your spaghetti in the fridge again. Like, can we talk this out? What happened? Rather than, you know what I mean? How do we do that over Zoom? It feels different, you know?
Yeah, it's interesting because it relates to your personality type. Like, and you could just say introvert and extrovert, but it's much more nuanced than that. But that's an easier way to look at it. It's not that there are more or less conflicts at work. First of all, I would say people would say, oh, there's less conflict because we're working virtually. There's not that there's more or less, there's different types of conflict. So
Mm,
what we saw in the past, that maybe people who felt more comfortable with in-person interactions, or uncomfortable, but either way, in-person interactions, they might take the liberty of being snarky, or of ignoring someone, or having some type of in-person conflict. What you're seeing now with virtual work is that different types of personalities are coming out. So the person who would not have necessarily been snarky in your face feels more comfortable being snarky over email because they haven't seen you for a year, and maybe they won't ever meet you. But also, what's happening,
mhm,
people are working late at night, you're in your bed. I don't drink, but someone might be in their bed at 10:30 p.m. and after two glasses of wine, they feel, loosened up enough to fire off a sassy email, or to issue some type of emotionally unintelligent retort to a team member. So it's not,
mm,
the conflict is different. The solution is the same for me. It's always about self-advocacy. So first of all, I start with empathy. If someone is snarky or rude, or they're a bully, or any of that stuff, I'm always empathetic, because when I see behaviors that show a level of emotional ignorance, I think of it like a technical skill. It's just something they don't know how to do. Like, just like if I give somebody a computer program, they don't know how to use it, they're not technically savvy at that skill yet. So if there's an emotional situation and they don't know how to handle it, they're not emotionally savvy yet. So I start with empathy. That's number one. And number two, I'm always advocating for myself, but keeping the work mission at the center. So I'm going to protect my emotions, or I'm going to express them with the work mission at the center. Like, when you said this to me, this is how I experienced it, and this is how it's impacting the project. So it's not going to be about my emotions, because if I say, if you said this to me and this is how I experienced it, that has nothing to do with work. That might just be me and my corporate trauma. So if I say this is how it impacts the project, that has a lot to do with work. So I need you to
mm,
communicate with me this way, or we need to figure out how we're going to communicate best, because the project requires these sets of things. Because otherwise, it's your personal preference. Like, one person's assertiveness can be another person's aggressiveness. Those are, in a lot of ways, are emotional taste buds that have little reality in the world. I've worked with leaders, and I've done behavioral assessments for lots of leaders, and you read their behavioral report, it says, super independent and very assertive about uh, their ideas. One direct report will say, I like Kareem because he's super independent and he's very assertive about his ideas. Another direct report will say, I dislike Kareem because he's so independent and he's so assertive about his ideas. So it's just those are emotional taste buds. Now there are real cases where there's real conflict and someone's cursing you out. Nope, that's happening at work. But in between that, there's a lot of style and nuance. So to solve, first of all, I would say there's different types of conflict in the virtual world as opposed to the in-person going to a building world. Not more or less conflict. It's just different. I think the tools I use are, first of all, empathy for the person who is the perpetrator of the conflict. Secondly, knowing that everyone has emotional taste buds and it's not so clear cut as they're right and I'm wrong or I'm right and they're wrong. And thirdly, I'm going to advocate for myself towards the work goal, I should say. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And this actually bleeds into our next topic. How to be assertive without being a bully. Because I remember once you had left and I had taken over your position as director of interns at Upward Bound, I felt like I needed to be like super tough and assertive and direct, even at the cost of being hurtful, in order to make sure everybody was in line, quote unquote,
Mhm.
and everything was in order. And how would I say, like everything worked out the way I imagined and I wanted it to work out. And I ended up like, hurting a lot of feelings along the way, things I'm not proud of, I should say. So where is that balance of like being respected as an authority, but also not being despised as that same authority?
Well, as you know, Kibbs, my opinion has changed on this. I've done a 180 on this whole subject of assertiveness and authority. Well, and you all know this, so it won't take you by any surprise. I don't think those traits are necessary or even valuable in the workplace anymore. I think it's partly due to my own evolution because I was a bully boss. I fully admit, like I was my 360s with 360 reviews. For people don't know, the reviews you get from all of your employees or everyone surrounding you who works with you gives you a review. That's why they call it a 360. My 360 review said as much. Every year it said the same thing. Every people were intimidated by me. It took me probably 3 years to really hear the feedback that was clear, and it took me maybe another 3 to 5 years to change who I was. So I think that assertiveness is not I think there are other traits that can take the place of that. So what I would say, I've been listening to a lot of Richard Branson. He owns all of the Virgin brands. So if you don't know who he is, you should take a look because his videos are really insightful. What he says and what one of Virgin's missions, core values is, and what I agree with is that you don't criticize anybody. Well, I don't know if it's a core value, but it's something I don't misquote me, but it is something that Richard Branson says a lot. At Virgin, one of the reasons why they're successful is that you praise people and you don't criticize them. Inside of that, you can give people feedback to help them do their jobs better, but none of that, all of that should have no emotional charge. The feedback should not have anger or hostility or disappointment because then again, as a leader, those are your emotions, and it's not critical to the work mission. It's actually invaluable and destructive to the work mission. So I would say, and you know this, Kibbs. I know it's not taking you by surprise. I'm such a I think people would say I'm a very nice person now, and I'm so zen about every single situation I'm in that I see that there's no reason for assertiveness. There's, as a leader or even as a team member, you want to give people feedback in any direction. You want to give your direct reports feedback. You want to give your colleagues feedback. You want to give your bosses and other senior leaders feedback because you're all there to do the job better. And that's a much different take on it. So I would say delete the assertiveness, delete the authority, and start to think about the work mission and say, how can I help myself and everyone optimize their output towards this goal?
Yeah. And how this is one thing that I've been working on a lot at work. What do you think is the most effective way of getting people on board towards those goals? Because full transparency, I'm not somebody that enjoys meeting. I think most a meeting once a week is more than enough, and most things can be communicated over email. But we depending on who's in leadership and depending what job I have at the moment, there are uh some people in authority like to have meetings every single day, and that for me, I feels like that kind of that gnaws at me, and I feel like it's almost like wearing me thin, simply because it's like I'm basically saying the exact same thing to different people in authority, when I could be using that time to prepare for other things, or working at the task at hand. How how many other ways do you think there are of bringing people um towards the mission that doesn't require a meeting every single day?
Well, it's interesting because if you think about the structure of the organization for the individual, and I've been on all ends of it, for the individual contributor, it might feel like there's a lot of meetings, but for the leader who has 14 or 22 or 36 or 78 or 500 direct reports, depending on the size of the organization, the meeting is the most efficient way to get all of the information from all of those different people. So if you look at it from the function of the leader, for the individual contributor, yeah, it could seem like there's a lot of meetings, but the only other option for the leader is that I'm going to have 22 individual meetings to get everyone's feedback. And then, or I'm going to exchange 13 different email messages. So a meeting is efficient oftentimes for the leader. And it's important for team members to understand the function of the meeting, because the leader is the person who has to take the feedback back and execute the decision or advocate on the team member's behalf. So, so it's interesting as anyone enters a meeting to look at it in the reverse and see what might be the function of this outside of my own scope of work. So that's one thing. It's popular to say that meetings aren't needed until you're the person setting the meetings, and you have 4 a week, and you have 8 different agenda items that you have to execute and for 5 different teams. So, and I worked at Cirque du Soleil for so many years, and I worked across 7 shows in Las Vegas. I was not leading 7 shows, of course. I was not the CFO or any of that, but I did work with the show teams, and we had to have production meetings, and it was easier for everyone to come into one room across the show than for me to try to email each person individually to get all the details. It just wouldn't have worked. So, so I would say think about the function of the meeting, and then as you grow in leadership, you can think about how you can make it more efficient, or if the meeting is the most efficient way of doing it.
That's a really good point. I feel kind of stumped right now. I didn't even think about it that way, because I just see myself as like going into a room and just saying the same thing I said yesterday again and again and again. And and I think that maybe that's like the emotional muscle I need to work on,
Mm.
because I just don't really have the patience for repetition. But then when I think about it now, after the way you just described it, I'm like, oh, this is the first time this person's hearing me say that, even though I've said it for the past 3 days. But I'm just like, oh, so that's a very good point. I actually really didn't think of that. That's a really, really good point.
It's interesting because I have coached some people. I've been coaching for 6, 7 years as they've graduated in their careers, and then people who have begun it as individual contributors, and they totally disagree with things that leaders and managers are doing. I say I can understand that. Let's see how it will work when you get direct reports, because often I'm coaching leaders up the scale from individual contributor to manager to director to associate VP to VP to wherever they want to go. So I have coached a lot of leaders up that scale, and then they've come back and said now they have to make a decision, exit an employee, or they've been given some sensitive information that they can't share with the team members, or they know there are layoffs coming, or they know that they are hiring someone for a set reason, but the other team members don't know. So it looks like nepotism. So when you get in the leadership position, you see all of the technicalities behind. Like on the stage, it looks fine, like ballerinas or ballet dancers generally. It looks graceful, but when you're on stage with them, it's very noisy and their feet are thumping and toes are bleeding. So that's the part you don't see. You don't see the part where the leaders their feet are stomping and their toes are bleeding. You just think they're up there doing their leadership thing. There's a lot of stuff going on in the background.
Well, that's such a brilliant way of putting it. Actually, that's really, really good. We had talked this week about like how do you enter conflict that you have with anybody, and especially with people in authoritative positions, because um the first thing that you had told me is like to enter with like empathy, because there's so much going on behind the scenes, like you just mentioned, that we are just not aware of. And the difficulty is like, and the thing that I need to work on and meditate on is like being okay with that uncertainty, knowing that like that person is making a decision and they can't give me all the reasons why they made that decision, but I have to trust in the fact that okay, it's being done for the greater good of the team. And I just have to be okay with that and then follow through with it to not damage the bond, to refocus on the goal. So that level of empathy is it's tough, but I do remember being in that position before and making a decision that all the other interns disagreed with, but I had to make that decision because it was better for the community as a whole, and I couldn't share exactly why I had made that make that decision and being like villainized for it. So it's 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 nice to just remember that space, you know.
And I would
Yeah.
say it's just if you again if you keep the why are we at work? It's like you're at work because we're trying to build an IT platform or we're trying to market for a soda company or we're trying to produce a show or we're trying to teach kids or whatever we're trying to do. So if you keep that mission at the center, there's not conflict. I mean, it just no longer exists in your head because we're at work, we have different thoughts about something, we had a sticky interaction. Okay, we're trying to market for a soda company, so let's go in and clean up this interaction or this disagreement so that we can continue to market best for the soda company so that they can enjoy our work and they can recommend us, and we set the organization up for making more money so that they can pay us more money. There's a math to it. It has nothing to do with, I think what's interesting about work. Work is tricky because we're entering the organization as people and we have emotional, we're under organizations people, I should say, and we have emotions, we have an ideological inheritance, we have our own preferences, and those things are coming with us at work. We're not going to leave those things at home. And at the same time, there is a clear clinical mission, for profit or nonprofit. There's a reason why you're there. You're trying to do something. Our own work trauma, our preferences, our spiritual and religious beliefs, our ideological inheritances, they are mingling with the work environment. We've not been taught to acknowledge that. So that's where the conflict comes in because we're people
Mhm.
with personalities and preferences. And that's in the work environment. It's there. Yet nothing at work or nothing even about school teaches us how to manage our peopleness in school or at work. So that's where the challenge comes in. For your listeners, kids, for the listeners, the master key is the judo of it all is you understanding who you are first. It's like these are my preferences, these are my quirks, this is what I like and I don't like. None of that stuff is real in the world. So understanding it and understanding that's not real. Think of who you are as your taste buds. You have a food that you don't like, but you can't say that food doesn't taste good. It doesn't taste good to you. You don't like it, but that's not, you can't blanket that over the world. What you do if you lack emotional intelligence is that you go to work with your personal taste buds about who people should be. And when they're not the way that you like, then you say, they're this and he's that and she's this and they're that. No, they just they're acting in a way different from what you like. That's what's happening. And that's going to happen everywhere you work. So if you like, Abraham Hicks has a great um, little passage in one of her things. And she says it's so illogical that we say, I want everyone to go over there and act like this so that I can feel better. Everyone in the world do these things and act like this so that I can feel better. It's illogical. And so the emotional intelligence part of it, again, is the master key is to say, I have my preferences. I know what they are. I know when I'm being triggered. It has nothing to do with how anyone else in the world is going to interact with me. Because if I'm waiting for them to serve me only the things I like, that's just probably not going to happen.
Yeah. Wow. Oh, Jay, that really hit the nail on the head, by the way. I really like that. And I also want to say that that's actually one thing that I appreciated most about our interactions over the past like 15 years. Actually, no, 17 now when I think about it. But it's the fact that I think that you've always encouraged me to just be aware of like all of the emotions I bring in to the work and all the different spaces I actually interact with. And you've always like give me different tools in order to address them. Because I think one thing that I remember one of my other supervisors had said at another job that I worked as like, oh, your emotions don't matter here. Like you are here to do this task and then you go home. And I felt so ignored at when that person said that. But also I understand what that person's trying to say. But what you're saying is something that's far more human and far more understanding. It's like, yes, your emotions do matter. And yes, you're going to have these experiences. You have had this past, your work trauma, your work experiences, X, Y, and Z. Bring all of that in, be aware of it, but just make sure that whatever that means to you, the work still remains centered. That's always what's going to be at the forefront. And I think that's far different than telling people to go to work and be a machine and go home, you know? So just want to
Yeah,
note
and I
that.
would say it's interesting because your emotions do matter. And I'll tell you for a fact that people will not want to hear this, but if you listen and you take it in, it will change your world. They're not real because if they were real, then everyone would have the same emotional response to the same situation. It's the gravity, everyone has the same response to gravity. You get tipped off a building, guess what? Oops, that's gonna hurt. But everyone doesn't have the same emotional response to events, and you even events like that can be as tragic as death. One of the most common emotional responses to death is uncontrollable laughter. You wouldn't. There are people who when they hear that someone died, they laugh uncontrollably. So that is a common because it seems so absurd. So you would think like, oh, you would say, well, what about death? Everyone gets sad. That's not true. In some countries, people celebrate death, and some people look forward to death. That's why, unfortunately, people commit suicide. Some people think death is a solution. Unfortunately, that's why there's mass shootings and mass murders. So even when you think of like, well, death is the same. No, it's not. We don't have the same responses. So when you look out into the world and you accept the world as a beautiful collection of billions of individuals, each living their life as they should, then you don't walk into work or any situation superimposing your one sliver of a perspective about what everyone should be. I remember this came to me bluntly years ago when I was out with a friend and we went to a grocery store. This is probably 15 years ago. And the cashier, my friend had an interaction with the cashier, and the cashier, I would say clinically, the cashier, their words were short. They did not make eye contact. They There were no niceties. And as soon as they finished their transaction with us, they just turned around. My friend's judgment of that interaction was that, oh, they're rude, they're this, they're a blank. And I asked my friend, and as I asked my friend, the revelation came to me. I said, well, do you know that her mother just died? And she's like, oh, I didn't know that. I said, well, I don't either. I don't even know her, but her mother could have just died yesterday, or she
Mm.
answer, or she just doesn't like us. Either way, it doesn't have anything to do with us. It does. It has nothing to do. But you don't know. I've worked with a lot of team members that demonize their leaders, and I've been on the side of leaders where they've just had a special needs kid, or they've lost their house, or they have a teenager who's addicted to drugs, or they know that they're about to get fired, or that you're underperforming and they don't know how to tell you. You don't know what's happening with the leader, so you can't read the behavior from your sliver of an observation and your sliver of a preference. If you can delete that from your behavior and from the way your mind is thinking, you have the master key to win in any work environment.
Yeah, and I really love that. And I also think that being aware of one's preferences, and being keeping everything work centered makes it much easier to provide constructive feedback. Because I think people are always quick to provide criticism and they label that as feedback. It's like, oh, I hate my boss because she or he is X, Y, and Z. It's like, well, that's not constructive in any way. Like, how does that help with the work? But if you can say that, like, when my boss throws things at me and screams at me and makes it hard for me to focus on my job. It's like, oh, is far more constructive. And I hope your boss isn't doing that too, you know? So that makes a lot of sense actually. That makes a ton of sense. Mm, mm. Jay, that was all on my end. As always, I always encourage people to plug in. I want you to plug in everything about yourself, and that's also going to be available in the description and at the very bottom of this video as well, so that way everybody can connect with you for support.
All right, excellent. Yeah, and they can go to my website at www.coworkslead.com. And there's a lot of, actually, there's a ton of free videos about workplace topics. So I don't expect you, unless you want to, you can hire me to come in and do some training, but I don't expect that. What you can do is go there and look at the videos, and there's different topics like, you know, the one Kibbs about romance at work, people might find useful, or how to give feedback, or you know, the DEI stuff can be helpful too. There's a new one. I only have one TikTok video, folks, and it's about how to ask for a pay raise, but I think Kibbs found that especially useful, right?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. It was very, very helpful. So I will actually link that as well, so that way people can see it for sure.
Okay. All right.
Awesome. Jay, that's all. You can just hit the stop once you're done.